It began with fire, not the fire of bombs or artillery, though those would come soon enough, but the fire of 10,000 torches held aloft by citizens who had simply decided, all at once, that they had endured enough. On a cold Tehran evening in January 1979, Roya Tehrani pressed herself against the rough concrete wall of a narrow alleyway, clutching a worn photograph of her father to her chest. He had been a schoolteacher, a gentle man who loved poetry, who recited Hafez at the dinner table, and who had been taken from their home 3 years earlier by agents of Savak, the Shah's secret police. She never learned what he had done wrong. Perhaps he had said something. Perhaps someone had reported him for a casual remark about bread prices. Perhaps it was nothing at all. As Roya peered around the corner into the boulevard, she saw her neighbours. The baker, the pharmacist, the retired colonel who always smelled of tobacco, all marching side by side in the flickering orange light, their voices unified in a chant she had heard growing for months: Marg Bar Shah, death to the Shah. The words that once would have gotten any one of them arrested, tortured, disappeared. Now they rang out openly, defiantly, in their hundreds of thousands, like a prayer that had finally outgrown the closet where it had been kept in secret. She stepped out of the alleyway and joined them. She did not know, in that moment, that the Shah would be gone in weeks. She did not know that a cleric in exile named Ruhollah Khomeini would return to Tehran aboard a commercial airliner on February 1st, greeted by a crowd of millions, the largest public gathering in human history at that time. She did not know that the revolution she was joining would, within a year, replace one form of oppression with another that was, in certain devastating ways, more complete and more ideologically sealed. She did not know that the political transformation she was helping to birth would redraw the map of Middle Eastern geopolitics for generations, that it would ignite an 8-year war with Iraq that would swallow 1 million lives, that it would harden the Cold War's front lines in ways Washington had never anticipated, or that the ripples of this night would still be crashing against Iranian shores. More than 40 years later, shaking the daughters and granddaughters of women just like her. All she knew was that the world felt, for the first time in her life, as though it might be about to change. And it was. The 1979 Iranian Revolution was not merely a political event. It was a civilizational rupture. A moment when centuries of monarchical tradition, decades of Western interference, years of suppressed religious identity, and generations of accumulated grievance converged into a single, world-altering convulsion. It is a story of idealism betrayed and power seized. It is a story of a people who reached for freedom and found themselves holding something far more complicated. It is a story of foreign policy, of religious law, of martyrdom and censorship and protest, of women forced to cover themselves and then, 40 years later, tearing the covering away in the streets while the world watched. But above all, it is a story that is still being told, because the revolution never really ended. It only changed shape. What follows is that story, told in 6 chapters, beginning long before the barricades went up and ending in the present day, where Iranian women walk uncovered through Tehran's boulevards, daring the government to stop them. It is a story about what happens when a people revolt, about what politics looks like when it fuses with God, about how a nation defines itself when every institution that defined it before has been burned to the ground. It begins, as all great stories do, with someone who held power and someone who did not. It begins with a king. To understand the revolution, you must first understand the world it destroyed and why so many people wanted it destroyed. Iran in 1978 was, on paper, a modern nation. Beneath the Alborz mountains, Tehran gleamed with new highways and high-rises. Oil revenues had flooded the country throughout the 1960s and 70s, financing a rapid modernization project that the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, called the White Revolution. Universities opened. Literacy campaigns were launched. Land redistribution programs were enacted. Women were given the right to vote by certain visible metrics. GDP growth, urban development, the presence of American consumer goods in department store windows. Iran looked like a developing success story, a Middle Eastern nation charting a course toward first world prosperity. But underneath that gleam, the nation was rotting. To understand how, you need to go back not just years but centuries. Iran's history of monarchy stretches into the deepest reaches of recorded civilization. The Median Empire, established in the 7th century BCE, was among the earliest monarchical structures in the region. What followed was a procession of dynasties, Achaemenid, Parthian, Sassanid, each leaving layers of political culture that valued centralized, divine right rule as the natural order of things. The concept of the King of Kings, or Shahanshah, was not merely a title, it was a cosmological claim. The king was not just a political ruler, he was the axis around which the universe of Iranian civilization turned. When Islam arrived in Iran in the 7th century CE, it did not erase this tradition. It absorbed it, transformed it, and gave it new theological dimensions. The Persian tradition of sacred kingship blended awkwardly but powerfully with Islamic conceptions of divine governance. For the Shia Muslim majority of Iran, however, there was an additional theological complication. The legitimate ruler of the Islamic world was supposed to be a descendant of the Prophet, a member of the line of imams that stretched from Ali ibn Abi Talib forward. All other rulers, in strict Shia theology, were provisional, tolerated out of necessity until the hidden imam returned. This created a latent political tension at the heart of Iranian society. The king ruled, but his right to rule was always, at the theological level, contested. By the time the Qajar dynasty gave way to the Pahlavi dynasty in the early 20th century, this tension had not resolved. It had merely been papered over. The Pahlavi Shahs. First Reza Shah, who seized power in a coup in 1921, and then his son Mohammad Reza, ruled with an iron hand that grew progressively less interested in the accommodation of religious authority. In fact, both Shahs were openly disdainful of the clerical establishment, viewing the mullahs as obstacles to modernization rather than legitimate participants in governance. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi was placed on the peacock throne under circumstances that were, from the beginning, deeply compromised. During World War II, British and Soviet forces jointly occupied Iran and forced the abdication of Reza Shah, who was viewed as dangerously sympathetic to Nazi Germany. His 21-year-old son was installed in his place, a young, inexperienced ruler who was, from day one, perceived by many Iranians as a foreign imposition rather than a legitimate sovereign. The compromised nature of the Shah's claim to power became catastrophically clear in 1953. Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, a nationalist politician who had become prime minister in 1951, had made the fateful decision to nationalize Iran's oil industry, which had been controlled by the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. This was enormously popular domestically. Oil was Iran's primary natural resource, and the sense that foreign powers were extracting Iranian wealth while Iranians lived in poverty had long been a source of nationalist fury. But nationalization was not popular in London or Washington. The British government, furious at the loss of their oil revenues, imposed an international embargo on Iranian oil and lobbied the United States to take action. In 1953, the CIA and British intelligence jointly orchestrated Operation Ajax, a coup that overthrew the democratically elected Mossadegh, arrested him, and returned the Shah, who had briefly fled the country, to power. The importance of this moment cannot be overstated. From 1953 onward, Mohammad Reza Shah's legitimacy in the eyes of millions of Iranians was permanently stained. He was not a king who had inherited his throne from a beloved ancestor. He was a man who had been put back on his throne by the Americans and British after a democratically elected leader had tried to stand up to foreign exploitation. Every subsequent action he took, every social reform, every development program, every modernization initiative was shadowed by this original sin, and the Shah knew it. His response was not to build legitimacy through genuine political inclusion. It was to build security through repression. SAVAK, the Sazman e Etala'at va Amn Iyyate Keshvar, or National Intelligence and Security Organization, was established in 1957 with significant assistance from the CIA and Israel's Mossad. It quickly became one of the most feared secret police forces in the world. SAVAK monitored mail, tapped telephone calls, cultivated networks of informants in every neighborhood, university, and workplace in the country.
Dissidents were arrested without warrants, detained without trial, and subjected to torture methods that Amnesty International would later describe in horrifying detail. Electric shocks, beatings, mock executions, and techniques specifically designed to break the human will. Estimates of those tortured and killed by Savak under the Shah's reign vary, but by the late 1970s, Amnesty International described Iran as having one of the worst human rights records in the world. The intellectual and cultural life of the country was frozen. Writers, poets, filmmakers, and academics operated under constant surveillance. Secular leftists, communist organizers, religious reformers, and Islamist activists alike found themselves in Savak's prisons. This was the paradox that defined the Shah's Iran. On the surface, a modernizing, westernizing, cosmopolitan nation.
Beneath the surface, a police state in which no one was truly safe, and in which political speech was an act of bravery that could end in disappearance. The White Revolution of 1963 attempted to address the economic and social causes of unrest. Land reform, women's suffrage, the expansion of literacy programs, and profit-sharing initiatives for workers were all part of a six-point package that the Shah launched by referendum. Many of these reforms were genuinely positive in isolation, but they were implemented without democratic consent, announced unilaterally by a monarch who had no interest in building a political coalition, and accompanied by escalating repression that made any real political debate impossible. More importantly, the White Revolution alienated a crucial constituency, the clerical establishment. The land reform threatened the economic foundations of the religious endowments, the Awqaf, that funded the mosque network. The women's suffrage provision violated what many clerics saw as the proper order of Islamic society. The push toward westernization felt, to the deeply religious, like an assault on the soul of Iran. A young cleric named Ruhollah Khomeini gave a famous speech in 1963 denouncing the White Revolution, calling the Shah a puppet of America and Israel. He was arrested, causing riots in Tehran and several other cities. After his release, he continued his opposition, and in 1964, after he denounced a law that granted legal immunity to American military personnel in Iran, he was exiled. Khomeini went to Iraq and then to France, but he did not disappear. He continued to issue political and religious pronouncements, developing his revolutionary doctrine of Wilayat al-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, which argued that in the absence of the hidden imam, supreme political authority should rest not with a secular monarch, but with a qualified Islamic scholar. This was a radical departure from traditional Shia political thought, which had tended to counsel quietism and acceptance of existing authority. Khomeini was proposing a revolution not just of government, but of theology. Back in Iran, the social contradictions of the Shah's regime were sharpening. The oil boom of the early 1970s, triggered by the OPEC embargo, poured extraordinary wealth into Iran, but distributed it extraordinarily unevenly. A thin stratum of the urban elite. Westernized professionals, military officers, entrepreneurs connected to the state became fantastically wealthy. The working classes, the rural poor, and the bazaar merchants who formed the economic backbone of traditional Iranian commerce were largely left behind. Tehran swelled with rural migrants who lived in shanty towns on the city's edges, cut off from the oil wealth that was funding the glittering new neighborhoods a few kilometers away. By the mid-1970s, inflation was rising, unemployment was growing, and the symbolic dissonance between the Shah's ostentatious luxury and the poverty of ordinary Iranians had become impossible to ignore. In 1971, the Shah had thrown a party in the ruins of Persepolis to celebrate what he called 2,500 years of Persian kingship. A celebration so lavish, so shamelessly extravagant, attended by so many foreign dignitaries while ordinary Iranians went without adequate food and medicine, that it became a monument to his tone deafness. The Pahlavi dynasty was seen, across ideological lines, as a lavish, brutal, and corrupt regime that had stripped Iran of its dignity. Liberal Democrats resented the destruction of Mossadegh and the elimination of genuine political competition. Communists and leftists resented the economic inequality and the state's alliance with American capitalism. Islamists resented the secularization program and the affront to religious identity.
The educated middle class resented the censorship that made intellectual life a minefield. Even the traditional merchant class, the Bazaris, who had historically been a conservative and stabilizing force in Iranian society, resented the Shah's economic policies, which favored Western-style corporations and state monopolies over the traditional market. What united all these groups was not a shared ideology. It was a shared enemy. Mohammad Reza Shah had managed the remarkable feat of alienating virtually every significant constituency in Iranian society simultaneously. The revolution that was coming would not be a leftist revolution, or an Islamist revolution, or a nationalist revolution. It would be all of these things at once, held together by the single, explosive force of a population that had simply had enough. In the summer of 1977, as if the social pressure cooker had finally reached its limit, things began to shift. The Shah, facing pressure from the newly elected Carter administration in the United States over his human rights record, slightly loosened the political reins. It was a tiny opening, but in a country where political expression had been hermetically sealed for decades, even a crack in the lid could produce an eruption. Poets published open letters. Lawyers signed petitions demanding the rule of law. Writers demanded freedom of expression. These were not revolutionary documents. They were requests for the basic conditions of a functioning civil society. But in Shah's Iran, even these modest petitions felt seismic. And then, in January 1978, everything accelerated. A newspaper article, likely planted by the government, attacked Khomeini with crude personal insults. Rather than damaging Khomeini's reputation, it triggered mass protests in Qom, the center of Shia scholarship, in which several students were killed by security forces. The killings triggered the first in a cycle of protests and state violence that would consume Iran for the rest of the year. Traditional Shia mourning custom dictates that the dead are commemorated on the 40th day after their death. The 40-day cycle became a protest rhythm. Each round of deaths produced another round of mourning demonstrations, which produced new deaths, which produced new demonstrations. By the autumn of 1978, millions of people were in the streets. The army was struggling to contain the unrest. Savak was overwhelmed. The Shah's system of control, which had seemed so impregnable for so long, was visibly crumbling.
The woman in the alleyway, Roya, holding her father's photograph, was not a political scientist. She did not have a theory of revolution. She had a grief and a fury, and neighbors who were finally willing to say out loud what everyone had been thinking in private for years. That, in the end, was what brought down the Shah. Not ideology, not foreign intervention, not a military coup. A people who had been caged too long and had finally, collectively, decided to push the door open. The question, the devastating, consequential question that would define the next 4 decades, was who would be waiting on the other side. They were about to find out. The plane touched down at Mehrabad Airport at 9:33 in the morning on February 1st, 1979. It was a chartered Air France Boeing 747. Aboard, it was a 76-year-old man with a white beard, black clerical robes, and eyes that seemed to hold, depending on who you asked, the light of God or the cold of steel. He had been in exile for 15 years. He had been denounced by a government, mocked in its newspapers, branded a lunatic and an agitator. He had watched from Paris, from Iraqi Najaf, from Neauphle Le Chateau, as the country he had vowed to transform slowly, inexorably, became ungovernable. When Ruhollah Khomeini stepped off that plane, 3 million people were waiting at the airport and along the route into Tehran. Millions more lined the city streets. It was, by any measure, one of the largest crowds ever assembled to welcome a single human being. Reporters from every major news organization on Earth were present. They described a scene of extraordinary, overwhelming intensity. People weeping, fainting, chanting, reaching out to touch the motorcade as it passed, throwing flowers, pressing against the barriers with an ecstatic urgency that made the air itself feel charged. A French journalist who traveled with Khomeini from Paris wrote afterward that the old man had seemed unmoved.
Throughout the flight, while reporters buzzed around him with notebooks and cameras, while fellow passengers trembled with excitement, Khomeini had sat in quiet dignity, fingering his prayer beads. One reporter, hoping to capture a memorable quote, had leaned close and asked what Khomeini was feeling, returning to Iran after 15 years. Khomeini looked at him for a moment. "Nothing," he said. Whether this was genuine serenity, political performance, or something stranger and more unsettling. A man so absolutely certain of God's purpose that personal emotion had become irrelevant was a question that Iranian history would spend the next decade answering. But before we can understand what Khomeini brought with him on that plane, we need to understand what he was landing into. Because the revolution was not simply waiting for him to lead it. The revolution was already in motion, already messy, already full of competing factions, ideologies, and visions of what Iran should become. Khomeini's genius and his ruthlessness lay in the speed and decisiveness with which he maneuvered through this chaos to seize total control. The protest cycle that had begun in January 1978 had continued to escalate throughout the year. The Shah, visibly shaken and reportedly battling the cancer that would kill him 2 years later, had vacillated between offering concessions and unleashing violent crackdowns. Neither worked. The concessions looked like weakness and emboldened protesters. The crackdowns generated martyrs and more protests. In September 1978, at Jaleh Square in Tehran, government forces opened fire on a large crowd of protesters. The number of dead is disputed. Official figures were far lower than those reported by witnesses. But the event, known as Black Friday, became a turning point. After Black Friday, there was no path back to normalcy. The question was no longer whether the Shah would fall. It was who would catch the country on the other side. Khomeini, from his base in France, had been extraordinarily effective at positioning himself as the unifying symbol of the opposition. This was not obvious or inevitable. The opposition to the Shah was composed of wildly different factions.
Secular liberals who wanted a democratic republic, Marxist-Leninist groups who wanted a workers' state, nationalist followers of Mossadegh's legacy who wanted social democracy, and religious conservatives who wanted an Islamic government. What unified them was opposition to the Shah. What divided them was everything else. Khomeini's political brilliance lay in projecting a studied ambiguity. From Paris, he gave interviews in which he spoke of freedom, democracy, and the rights of the people. He said things that sounded, to Western ears and to Iranian liberals, like a promise of pluralistic governance. He suggested that women would retain their rights, that political parties would be permitted, that a free press would flourish. He portrayed himself as a religious leader who would guide, not govern, a moral figure who would stand behind a democratic republic rather than controlling it. This was almost certainly calculated. Khomeini had been developing, for years, a doctrine called Wilayat al-Faqih, the political governance of the Islamic jurist, which was fundamentally incompatible with liberal democracy. But in the revolutionary moment, with the Shah tottering and a million different futures still possible, he chose to tell people what they needed to hear to keep the coalition together. Meanwhile, on the ground in Iran, the Shah's government was dissolving. In late December 1978, the Shah made a critical decision. Hoping to manage the transition and preserve something of the constitutional monarchy, he appointed Shapur Bakhtiar as prime minister. Bakhtiar was a long-standing member of the National Front, one of the main secular opposition parties, a man of genuine liberal credentials who had spent time in Savak prisons for his opposition to the Shah. By appointing him, the Shah was making a desperate, last-minute offer to the liberal opposition. Here is one of your own. Let's find a way through this together. Bakhtiar accepted the appointment, which immediately cost him his standing in the opposition. His fellow members of the National Front expelled him. Khomeini denounced his government as illegitimate. He was politically destroyed the moment he took office. But he was also, for a brief and strange interlude, the legal head of an Iranian government, and he attempted to use that position to manage what he could see coming. On January 16, 1979, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi left Iran. He said he was going on a vacation. Everyone knew he was not coming back. At the airport,
Iranian television broadcast footage of the Shah, visibly pale and unsteady, walking to his plane. He paused at the bottom of the stairs and wept. Then he climbed aboard and flew away, carrying with him the 2,500-year tradition of Iranian monarchy, the peacock throne, and an era. Bakhtiar, left holding the wreckage, attempted something unprecedented. He announced that Khomeini was welcome to return to Iran, in a carefully managed way, as a religious figure, not a political one. He was trying to construct the Vatican model, Khomeini as a kind of Iranian pope, spiritually authoritative but politically separate. Khomeini, he imagined, would preside over the religious life of the country while Bakhtiar presided over the government. It was a reasonable idea that lasted approximately 72 hours after Khomeini's plane landed. Khomeini arrived on February 1st to the 3 million-person reception, made his way to a cemetery on the outskirts of Tehran where many revolution martyrs were buried, and delivered a speech that obliterated any pretense of the Vatican model.
He announced that Bakhtiar's government was illegitimate, appointed by a monarch who himself had been illegitimate. He announced that he would appoint his own government. And then, with the serenity of a man who had been absolutely certain all along of how this would go, he did exactly that. The quote attributed to Khomeini in the days following his return has become one of the most famous in the history of the revolution. Told that Bakhtiar considered himself the legitimate head of government, Khomeini reportedly said, "I shall kick their teeth in. I appoint the government. I appoint the government by the support of this nation." It was not a metaphor. He proceeded immediately to appoint Mehdi Bazargan as the head of a provisional government of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Bazargan was a liberal, a gentle engineer politician who had been involved in the National Front and was known for his attempts to reconcile Islam with democratic politics. His appointment was, in retrospect, another piece of the same strategic ambiguity Khomeini had been deploying for months. A moderate face on a revolutionary project that was rapidly heading somewhere the moderates would not like. For several extraordinary days in early February 1979, Iran had two governments. Bakhtiar, in the Prime Minister's offices, issuing orders that no one obeyed. Bazargan, in a building across the city, issuing orders that the revolutionary committees and the newly forming Revolutionary Guard followed. The army, sensing which way the wind was blowing, announced neutrality, which was effectively a decision for Khomeini. Bakhtiar's government had no army, no bureaucracy, no police, no legitimacy in the eyes of the population. On February 11th, 1979, the formal structures of the old government collapsed. Bakhtiar went into hiding and eventually fled to Paris, where he would live in exile until his assassination by Iranian agents in 1991, February 11th. The day the old government died is still commemorated annually in Iran as the anniversary of the Islamic Revolution. It is a public holiday marked by state-organized demonstrations, speeches by officials, and the burning of American and Israeli flags. For the Iranian government, it is a day of triumph. For Bakhtiar's ghost, and for the liberal secular Iranians who had imagined a different future, it is something else entirely. Bazargan's provisional government faced an almost impossibly difficult task. The revolution had swept away not just the Shah, but the entire apparatus of state, the bureaucracy, the military command structure, the police forces, the judiciary. In their place were hundreds of revolutionary committees, staffed by volunteers with Kalashnikovs and enormous revolutionary enthusiasm, but limited administrative competence. The economy was in turmoil. The oil industry had been effectively shut down by strikes. Inflation was soaring. The prisons were full of figures from the old regime awaiting revolutionary tribunals that were being conducted with a speed and informality that troubled anyone concerned with due process. Bazargan tried to build a functioning government. He tried to establish order, to protect those accused of crimes under the Shah from summary execution, to create the conditions for the political pluralism he believed the revolution had promised. He was, in many ways, exactly what the moment seemed to require. A conciliator, a pragmatist, a man who believed that the revolution could build something genuinely democratic and Islamic simultaneously. But Khomeini was not building a democracy. He was building a theocracy, and Bazargan's moderation was, from the beginning, a problem. The relationship between the two men was a slow-motion collision that was visible from the start to anyone who looked carefully. The collision was accelerated by external events. In October 1979, the Shah, sick, dying of cancer, and bouncing from country to country after none of his allies would offer him permanent asylum, was admitted to the United States for medical treatment. This decision by the Carter administration was presented as a humanitarian gesture. In Iran, it was perceived as the United States once again offering shelter to the man who had oppressed them, the man the CIA had reinstalled in 1953, the man whose Savak had tortured their fathers and brothers. The fury was immediate and volcanic. On November 4th, 1979, a group of Iranian students calling themselves the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran and took 66 American diplomats and embassy staff hostage. The hostage crisis, which would last 444 days and fundamentally reshape American-Iranian relations for the next half-century, was, in its immediate political effect in Iran, a grenade thrown into Bazargan's position. He had, that very day, met with President Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in Algiers, a meeting that, when it became public, was used to paint him as an American collaborator. 3 days after the embassy seizure, Bazargan resigned. He resigned knowing that he had been outmaneuvered. The Islamic Republic that was taking shape was not the republic he had hoped to build. It was something else, fiercer, more absolutist, less interested in pluralism than in consolidation. Khomeini's allies were moving quickly to write a constitution that would enshrine the Wilayat al-Faqih at its center, making clerical authority permanent and supreme. The liberal and leftist groups who had been the revolution's foot soldiers were discovering, with increasing horror, that they had helped to build a cage they now found themselves inside. Bazargan retired from active politics, though he continued to speak out against certain excesses of the Islamic Republic until his death in 1995. He became, in the years after his resignation, something of a moral witness to the revolution's betrayal of its own promises. A gentle, principled man who had tried to thread an impossible needle and learned, too late, that the needle had never existed. The revolutionary period officially ended on February 11th, 1979. But the revolution, in the deeper sense of a society being completely remade, had barely begun. What would follow was a decade of consolidation, purges, and the systematic dismantling of every alternative to clerical absolutism that the revolutionary moment had briefly made possible. But before that could happen, one more thing had to be decided. What kind of government was Iran going to be? The answer, written in the months following the revolution's triumph, would define the country for the rest of the century and beyond. In the spring of 1979, Iran held a referendum. It was a simple ballot. There was a green card and a red card. The green card said, Islamic Republic. The red card said, Democratic Islamic Republic. In some accounts, there was a third option, simply Republic. Voters were instructed to choose. The question of why the ballot offered only these narrow choices, why the option of a secular democratic republic was not among them, why the process of drafting a constitutional framework for a new Iran had been compressed into such an impossibly short and ideologically constrained process. These questions were asked at the time by liberal and leftist groups who had fought alongside Khomeini's followers during the revolution. Their concerns were met with the argument that speed was necessary, that the people had already expressed their will in the streets, and that those who opposed the Islamic Republic were, by implication, agents of the old regime or foreign powers. The referendum, held on March 30th and 31, 1979, returned a result of 98.2% in favor of the Islamic Republic. Turnout was reported at over 95%. The numbers strained credibility. No honest political process produces results that clean, but the underlying reality was that a substantial majority of Iranians did, in fact, favor some form of Islamic government. They had just overthrown a secular monarchy that had oppressed them for decades. They had done so under the banner of Islamic identity.
The idea of a government that reflected that identity was genuinely, broadly popular. What was not popular, or at least not clearly consented to, was what the phrase Islamic Republic would actually mean in practice. The constitutional drafting process that followed the referendum would reveal the gap between the revolution's promise and its reality. Khomeini had initially proposed a modest consultative assembly to draft the new constitution. The liberal and secular groups in the revolutionary coalition had hoped for a broad constitutional convention, a process that would draw on Iran's 1906 constitutional revolution tradition and produce a document reflecting the full range of political opinion in the country. What emerged instead was an assembly of experts for the constitution, a body of 73 members, many of whom were clerical allies of Khomeini, which drafted a document that placed the concept of wilayat al-faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, at its absolute center. Understanding wilayat al-faqih is essential to understanding everything that happened in Iran after 1979. The doctrine, as Khomeini had developed it, held that during the period of the hidden Imam's occultation, the theological state in which the 12th Imam of Shia Islam has been hidden from the world, awaiting the moment of his return. An Islamic jurist with the requisite knowledge of Sharia and the qualities of a just leader must assume political and religious authority on his behalf. This was not traditional Shia political theology, which had generally held that such authority was impossible to fully legitimize until the Imam returned. It was Khomeini's innovation, his political interpretation of a theological tradition that he had turned into a blueprint for revolutionary governance. The constitutional provisions that emerged from this doctrine were sweeping. The supreme leader, initially Khomeini himself, was granted absolute authority over the military, the judiciary, state media, and the foreign policy apparatus. He had the power to appoint the heads of the armed forces, the chief of the judiciary, and 6 of the 12 members of the Guardian Council.
The Guardian Council itself was given the power to veto legislation passed by the Parliament, the Islamic Consultative Assembly, and to approve or disqualify candidates for elections. In practice, this meant that the elected institutions of the Islamic Republic operated within a cage constructed and controlled by the unelected theocratic institutions. The architecture was simultaneously republican and theocratic. It had elections for president, for parliament, for local councils. But every election was filtered through an approval mechanism controlled by clerics appointed by the supreme leader. You could vote, but only for people the Guardian Council had decided were acceptable. You could pass laws, but only if the Guardian Council decided they were consistent with Sharia. You had political rights, but those rights existed within a framework designed to ensure that they could never fundamentally challenge the authority of the clerical establishment. To Khomeini, this was not a contradiction. He had said explicitly that democracy was a Western concept with no legitimate standing in Islamic governance. The appearance of democratic participation was, in his view, a courtesy extended to the people, a mechanism for expression within the framework of divine law, not a source of ultimate political authority. Ultimate authority came from God, expressed through the learned Islamic jurist who governed on God's behalf. He was, in this sense, a remarkably coherent political thinker. The coherence of his vision was part of its power. His followers did not have to perform intellectual gymnastics to reconcile his words with his actions, because his words and his actions were in almost perfect alignment. He said he would build an Islamic republic based on Sharia, and he built one. The problem that would haunt Iran for the next half-century, was that not everyone who had joined the revolution had signed up for this vision, and Khomeini moved with extraordinary speed to eliminate those who had not. The period from 1979 to 1983 saw a systematic purging of Iran's political landscape. The leftist organizations, the Feda-e Khalq, the Tudeh Party, the various Marxist and socialist groups that had fought alongside religious revolutionaries against the Shah were initially tolerated, then marginalized, then crushed. The Mojahedin Khalq, MIKE, a group that combined Islamist and Marxist ideology and had been one of the most significant guerrilla organizations of the revolutionary period, was declared an enemy of the state after a failed uprising in 1981. A campaign of violent suppression followed, in which thousands of MIKE members and sympathizers were executed. Estimates range from several thousand to tens of thousands.
The Kurdish population in the west of Iran, which had briefly tasted regional autonomy in the revolutionary chaos, was subjected to a military campaign to re-establish central control. Ethnic and religious minorities, Sunni Muslims, Christians, Jews, Baha'is, found their political rights drastically curtailed. The Baha'is, regarded by the Islamic Republic's constitution as apostates rather than a legitimate religious minority, faced particular persecution. Their leaders were executed, their property confiscated, their right to education and employment systematically denied.
The revolutionary tribunals that had begun operating immediately after the Shah's fall were issuing death sentences at a rate that alarmed even many supporters of the revolution. Former officials of the Shah's government, military officers, SAVAK agents. These were, perhaps, within the brutal logic of revolutionary justice. But the tribunals also sentenced people for drug possession, sexual offences under newly enacted Sharia codes, and political opposition. Execution became a routine instrument of social and political control. The political party system was, in the immediate post-revolutionary period, theoretically open. Multiple parties had operated during the revolutionary period, and many continued to function in the months after the Islamic Republic was declared. But Khomeini was deeply suspicious of party politics, which he associated with the divisiveness and foreign manipulation of the pre-revolutionary period. The Islamic Republican Party, established by key Khomeini allies including Ali Khamenei and Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, became the dominant political force. Effectively the party of the state, rather than a party operating within a democratic system. The IRP existed to consolidate and protect Khomeini's political position. Its membership was heavily clerical. Its ideology was uncompromising in its support for Wilayat al-Faqih. Any party or organization that challenged the primacy of clerical rule was, sooner or later, suppressed. By 1983, the political landscape had been effectively reduced to a single authorized ideology, loyalty to the Islamic Republic and its supreme leader. In 1987, Khomeini dissolved the IRP itself. This was not a sign of political opening. It was a sign that the system had been consolidated to the point where a formal party mechanism was no longer necessary. The Guardian Council, the Revolutionary Guard, and the apparatus of state were sufficient to maintain clerical authority. The party had served its purpose and was no longer needed. The constitutional framework that emerged from this process was, in one sense, a remarkable achievement of political engineering. It was designed to be self-perpetuating. The supreme leader appointed members of the Guardian Council. The Guardian Council approved candidates for the Assembly of Experts. The Assembly of Experts elected the supreme leader. The circle was closed, and it was closed in a way that made genuine political competition at the highest level essentially impossible. And yet, and this is crucial, it was not a simple military dictatorship. It was something more complex and, in some ways, more durable. A system that combined genuine popular participation at certain levels with iron control at others. Iranians did vote. They did participate in political life. There were real debates within the permissible space. The system had a legitimacy that was more than purely coercive, because it was grounded in a religious and cultural identity that millions of Iranians genuinely shared. This complexity has made it resistant to simple analysis and, arguably, resistant to collapse. Military dictatorships are vulnerable to coups and popular uprisings because their legitimacy rests entirely on force. Khomeini's Islamic Republic rested on force, but also on faith. And faith, when it is genuinely held, is a much more powerful foundation for political authority. Mehdi Bazargan, watching from the sidelines, understood what had happened. He had hoped that the revolution would produce a genuine Islamic democracy, a system in which Islamic values and democratic governance were reconciled and mutually reinforcing. What he had helped build instead was a system in which Islamic authority trumped democratic governance at every point where they came into conflict. He spent the rest of his life arguing, gently and persistently, that this outcome had been a betrayal of the revolution's promise. He was not wrong, but he was also not powerful enough to change it. The new government of Iran was built on a foundation of theological certainty, the certainty that Sharia contained all the wisdom necessary to govern a just society, and that the man who best understood Sharia had the right, the duty,
and the divine mandate to rule. For Khomeini, this was not a limitation, it was a liberation. He was building not just a new government, but a new civilization, a proof of concept that Islam could govern, that the Western model of secular democracy was not the only or even the best path to human flourishing. History would put this claim to a severe test. The first test came from outside Iran's borders, from a neighboring country that watched the revolution with fear, with ambition, and with the calculating eye of a man who saw an opportunity. His name was Saddam Hussein, and he was already sharpening his knives.
She was a doctor. Parvin Sadeghi had trained at Tehran University's medical school, graduated near the top of her class, and in 1978 had been working as a pediatric specialist at a public hospital in the capital. She had short hair, drove her own car, and had been considering applying for a fellowship in Germany. Under the Shah's modernization programs, women had made significant inroads into professional life, particularly in medicine, law, and academia. Parvin was part of that generation, educated, ambitious, secular in orientation, and deeply, genuinely Iranian. She had supported the revolution, not because she was religious, she was not particularly so, but because she had seen enough of the Shah's brutality to want something different, anything different. She had friends who had been in Savak prisons. She had heard enough stories of midnight arrests and disappeared professors to know that the system needed to change. In the months after February 1979, she watched the change arrive. First came the dress code. In March 1979, Khomeini announced that women working in government offices were required to wear the hijab. Protests erupted immediately. Thousands of women marched in Tehran on International Women's Day, March 8, 1979, chanting, "We did not make a revolution to go backward." The protests were met with verbal attacks from supporters of the new government, who called the women agents of imperialism and enemies of Islam. Within months, the hijab requirement had been extended and formalized into law. Women who appeared in public without appropriate covering faced arrest, fines, and eventually, in the early years of the Republic, violence from the guidance patrol, the morality police established to enforce Islamic conduct. Parvin put on a headscarf. She had no choice if she wanted to continue working. She told herself it was a small compromise, a piece of cloth, not worth destroying her career over. She was wrong and right simultaneously. It was a piece of cloth, and it was also the visible symbol of a vast transformation in the relationship between Iranian women and the state. The changes came quickly after that. Childcare centers were closed on the grounds that their secular orientation was un-Islamic and that mothers belonged at home. The family protection law, passed under the Shah in 1967 and expanded in 1975, which had given women substantial rights in divorce and child custody proceedings, was suspended and eventually repealed. The minimum marriage age for girls was lowered to 9, the age at which, under traditional Islamic jurisprudence, a girl was considered of age to marry. The testimony of a woman in court was deemed worth half that of a man. Women were barred from becoming judges. Several women who had held senior positions in the Shah's government were dismissed, some arrested, and at least one, Farrokhroo Parsa, who had served as Minister of Education, was executed. The charge against her was corruption on earth and warring against God, the elastic revolutionary charge that could be applied to almost anyone the new government decided was an enemy. The domestic transformation of post-revolutionary Iran was comprehensive and, from the perspective of those who had imagined a different outcome, devastating. But it was not only about women, though women's rights were among the most visibly and immediately affected. It was about the totality of political and social life. The newspapers that were shut down, the political parties that were banned, the cultural organizations that were dissolved, the artists and intellectuals who were imprisoned or fled. The media landscape changed overnight. The vibrant, contentious press that had briefly flourished during the revolutionary period. Newspapers of every political stripe, from communist to liberal to nationalist, was systematically shuttered. In 1979 and 1980, dozens of newspapers and magazines were closed, their offices raided by revolutionary guards, their editors arrested or driven into exile. What remained was a press that operated within strict ideological boundaries, subject to censorship by the Ministry of Culture and Islamic Guidance, which reviewed all publications for compliance with Islamic standards and loyalty to the revolution. The film industry, which had been one of the most vital in the Middle East under the Shah, was subjected to radical transformation. Many of the most celebrated directors of Iranian cinema, including some who would later achieve global recognition for films made under the constraints of the Islamic Republic, found their pre-revolutionary work banned, their projects shelved, and their creative freedom severely curtailed. The Islamic Republic initially shut down most of the country's movie theaters, viewing cinema as a vehicle for Western corruption. Eventually, a state-controlled cinema industry would develop, producing films that navigated the complex space between artistic expression and ideological compliance with a subtlety that became, paradoxically, one of the most distinctive features of Iranian culture under the Republic. Music was similarly affected. Western music was banned, mixed-gender concerts were prohibited, female vocalists were forbidden from performing for male audiences. The rich tradition of Persian classical music, along with the popular music that had flourished in Tehran's nightclubs and on the radio, was largely driven underground or into exile. Many of Iran's most celebrated musicians left the country, establishing Iranian diaspora music communities in Los Angeles, London, and Paris. The universities were closed for 2 years, from 1980 to 1982, for what the government called a cultural revolution, a process of purging the academic institutions of un-Islamic content and personnel. Hundreds of professors were dismissed. Curricula were rewritten to reflect Islamic principles. Western-influenced social science and humanities programs were particularly targeted. The university system that reopened in 1982 was a fundamentally different institution from the one that had closed. More controlled, more ideologically uniform, and, in many fields, academically diminished. The political party system that had briefly existed in the immediate post-revolutionary period was, as we have noted, systematically dismantled.
By the early 1980s, the only political competition that was tolerated was competition within the framework of loyalty to the Islamic Republic and its supreme leader. Those who challenged this framework, whether from the left, the liberal center, or the religious right, found themselves outside the system, and being outside the system in the Islamic Republic was a dangerous place to be. The Revolutionary Guard, the Sepah-i Pastoran, or Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, emerged as one of the most powerful domestic political actors. Established in May 1979 as a counterbalance to the regular army, which Khomeini distrusted as a potential locus of secular or monarchist sentiment, the IRGC became the military and security arm of the revolution rather than the state. Its loyalty was to the supreme leader and to the ideals of the Islamic Republic, not to Iran as a nation-state. Over time, it would evolve into one of the most powerful economic and military forces in the Middle East, controlling vast sectors of the Iranian economy through a network of affiliated companies, operating its own intelligence services and wielding political influence that made it effectively a state within the state. The economy that post-revolutionary Iranians inherited was badly disrupted. The oil workers' strikes that had helped bring down the Shah had devastated production. Capital flight was massive as the wealthy fled the country with what they could carry. Foreign investment evaporated. The seizure of the US embassy triggered international sanctions, and the government's ideological priorities, nationalizing large parts of the economy, redirecting resources toward religious institutions and revolutionary organizations, and managing the economy through a lens that prioritized Islamic principles over economic efficiency, produced distortions and inefficiencies that compounded the existing disruptions. The Iran-Iraq War, which began in September 1980 and would last 8 years, made everything worse. The war consumed enormous resources, diverted attention from economic management, and produced casualties that devastated entire communities. But it also, paradoxically, served the new government politically. Wars have a way of suppressing domestic opposition. Dissent in wartime is more easily painted as treason. The 8-year siege mentality of the war years helped the Islamic Republic consolidate its political authority and marginalize those who might otherwise have continued to challenge it.
For women like Parvin Sadeghi, the doctor who had supported the revolution and watched it narrow the space of her life, the domestic transformations of the 1980s were a long, slow reckoning with what had actually been built. She kept working. She kept her headscarf on. She told herself and told her patients that things would eventually get better. She was part of a generation of educated Iranian women who had made their peace with the Islamic Republic, not because they approved of it, but because they had concluded, pragmatically, that they could do more good by staying inside Iran than by leaving for Los Angeles or London. She was not wrong, and she was not right.
The women who stayed built careers within the constraints, and sometimes pushed those constraints outward through accumulation of expertise and social authority. The women who left built communities that preserved cultural memory and applied international pressure. Both choices were forms of resistance. Neither was sufficient. The Parliament, the Islamic Consultative Assembly, became, over time, a venue for genuine if constrained political debate. Different factions competed for seats and, within the permissible space, actually fought over policy. The tension between what might be called the pragmatist tendency and the ideological hardliner tendency was real and consequential. This was not a performance. Iranians who cared about governance, who wanted better economic management or a less aggressive foreign policy or a somewhat less repressive domestic policy, could and did find ways to express those preferences through the parliamentary system. But the Guardian Council was always there, at the boundary of what was permissible, ready to disqualify candidates who pushed too hard. Any politician who tried to fundamentally challenge the primacy of clerical authority quickly found their path blocked. The system was, by design, reformable at the margins and unreformable at the center. Local governance, provincial councils, municipal elections became spaces where a somewhat wider range of political expression was possible because the stakes were lower and the Guardian Council's scrutiny was less intense. Women ran for local office, and some won. Reformist politicians built local power bases that eventually formed the foundation for national reform movements. The seeds of the 1997 reform movement that would bring Mohammad Khatami to the presidency as a reformist candidate were planted in these smaller, quieter political spaces. The Iranian population in these years was also changing dramatically. The revolution had initially been made by an adult population that had lived through the Shah's era, that carried memories of the White Revolution, of Black Friday, of Savak. But by the mid-1980s, a younger generation was growing up that had known only the Islamic Republic, that had gone to school under its curriculum, that had absorbed its cultural formation, that had grown up with the mandatory headscarf and the gender-segregated public spaces as simply the way things were. This generation would eventually develop its own complicated relationship with the Republic. Neither the burning rejection of those who had been radicalized by the Shah's oppression, nor the simple acceptance of those who had never known anything else. They would become, by the 1990s and 2000s, a generation of remarkable sophistication, culturally hybrid, technologically connected, politically frustrated, deeply Iranian, and increasingly impatient with a government that treated them as subjects to be managed rather than citizens to be heard. Parvin Sadeghi's daughter, born in 1982, would be part of that generation. She would grow up to become a lawyer. Not without difficulty. Women were barred from the judiciary, but could practice as legal consultants and advocates. She would wear the hijab every day of her professional life, and she would hate it every day. And in 2022, when a young woman named Mahsa Amini died in the custody of the morality police, she would stand in the street in central Tehran with her headscarf in her hand, tears running down her face, and feel something that her mother had felt 43 years earlier in a different street under a different government, the sense that she had finally, at long last, had enough. The cycle was not yet complete, but it was turning. The telegram arrived at the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs on a November morning in 1979. It was brief and clinical. The United States Embassy in Tehran had been seized. All diplomatic personnel were being held hostage. Washington was requesting that Switzerland activate the arrangements under which it served as the protecting power for American interests in Iran. It was the beginning of a strange diplomatic odyssey that would make Switzerland, a small, landlocked European nation famous for banking secrecy, alpine cheese, and a centuries-old tradition of neutrality, into one of the most important middlemen in one of the most consequential bilateral disputes of the late 20th century. The Iran hostage crisis, which began on November 4th, 1979, and lasted 444 days, was not simply a diplomatic incident. It was a seismic event that restructured American-Iranian relations for generations, provided the new Islamic Republic with a propaganda triumph that helped consolidate its domestic authority, and demonstrated to the watching world that the government Khomeini was building was not interested in the ordinary courtesies of international diplomacy. To understand why the embassy was seized, you need to understand the extraordinary anger that had been building in Iran throughout 1979 at the decision to admit the deposed Shah to the United States for medical treatment. The CIA's role in the 1953 coup that had installed the Shah was not a secret in Iran. It was common knowledge, a defining fact of Iranian political consciousness, the original sin that explained everything. For millions of Iranians, the United States Embassy in Tehran was not just a diplomatic facility. It was a symbol of the foreign interference that had stolen their democracy and given them 25 years of SAVAK and repression. The den of spies, as it was called in revolutionary rhetoric, was a legitimate target in the war against Western imperialism. The students who stormed the embassy, the group that called themselves the Muslim student followers of the Imam's line, were acting on a genuine popular grievance that Khomeini, with his usual political acuity, chose to endorse rather than condemn. The crisis served his purposes. It destroyed Bazargan's moderate government, which fell immediately after the seizure, galvanized domestic public opinion behind the Islamic Republic, and positioned the new Iran as a power willing to confront American imperialism directly, regardless of the consequences. The consequences were severe. The United States severed diplomatic relations with Iran in April 1980, a breach that has never been formally healed. International sanctions were imposed. Iranian assets in the United States were frozen. Canada secretly helped 6 American diplomats who had escaped the embassy seizure escape from Iran, an operation that became legendary and permanently complicated Canadian-Iranian relations. The European Economic Community, in solidarity with the United States, imposed its own sanctions. The crisis finally ended in January 1981, with the hostages released in an agreement brokered through Algeria and, through back-channel negotiations, through Switzerland and other intermediaries, literally minutes after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president, a timing that has fueled conspiracy theories for decades. The Shah had died in Egypt in July 1980, having never been allowed to return to Iran. The diplomatic crisis he had triggered was resolved, but the underlying rupture in American-Iranian relations was permanent. The United Kingdom's relationship with Iran was, if anything, even more historically freighted than the American one. British involvement in Iranian affairs stretched back to the 19th century. The Great Game, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, the 1953 coup, decades of economic exploitation. When the Islamic Republic came to power, it viewed Britain with a hostility that combined ideological anti-imperialism with centuries of specific historical grievance. Diplomatic relations were severed, restored in modified form, then severed again at various points as specific crises erupted. The relationship would reach its nadir in 1989 when Khomeini issued his famous fatwa calling for the death of British author Salman Rushdie, triggering a further diplomatic crisis that led Britain to withdraw its diplomatic staff from Tehran. The anti-Zionist dimension of the Islamic Republic's foreign policy represented another dramatic shift from the Shah's era. Iran under the Shah had maintained working relations with Israel, not warm, not formal, but functioning. Both countries were American allies, and that shared alignment created a basis for quiet cooperation on intelligence and security matters. Under the Islamic Republic, the relationship was transformed into one of existential hostility. Israel was referred to as the Zionist entity. Its very existence denied legitimacy. Palestinian resistance movements, particularly Hamas and later Hezbollah in Lebanon, became clients of the Islamic Republic. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which had previously been a foreign policy matter for Iran, became a cornerstone of the Islamic Republic's ideological self-definition. This anti-Zionist stance served multiple purposes for the new government. It was genuinely popular in the broader Muslim world and gave Iran a claim to pan-Islamic leadership that transcended the Sunni-Shia divide.
It provided a perpetual enemy against which domestic unity could be mobilized. And it was theologically coherent within the framework of the Islamic Republic's ideology, which viewed Zionism as a form of colonialism and Western imperialism that Islam was obligated to resist. The Switzerland relationship that developed in the wake of the hostage crisis was a diplomatic oddity of considerable practical importance. Switzerland, as a non-member of NATO and the EEC, and with a long tradition of neutrality that predated both organizations, was uniquely positioned to maintain relations with Iran when almost all other Western nations had severed theirs.
The Swiss embassy in Tehran took over the management of American consular interests, issuing visas to Iranian Americans, handling emergencies involving American citizens in Iran. Swiss diplomats became the primary channel of communication between Washington and Tehran on the dozens of routine and occasionally critical matters that required communication between two governments that were officially not speaking to each other. This arrangement has persisted for decades. The Swiss protecting power arrangement remains in place today, a quiet, professional, somewhat surreal ongoing reminder of the permanent rupture of 1979 to 1981. But the most consequential foreign policy event of the Islamic Republic's first decade was not the hostage crisis. It was the war. On September 22, 1980, Iraqi armed forces crossed the border into Iran on multiple fronts. Saddam Hussein's decision to launch what he called the Qadisiyah of Saddam, invoking the 7th century Arab victory over the Sassanid Persian Empire, was motivated by a combination of strategic calculation and personal antagonism that, in retrospect, seems both rational and catastrophically miscalculated. The rational case for Iraqi intervention looked, in September 1980, reasonably strong. Iran was in chaos, its military purged of officers who had served under the Shah, its command structure disrupted, its morale uncertain. The new government was facing internal opposition from multiple directions. The hostage crisis had left it internationally isolated. The economy was in deep trouble. Saddam Hussein calculated that a quick strike could seize the oil-rich Khuzestan province, home to a substantial Arab minority, and force Iran to the negotiating table. He also calculated that Khomeini's pan-Shia ideology, which included explicit calls for Iraq's Shia majority to rise up against the Ba'athist government, constituted an existential threat to his regime that had to be addressed before it could materialize. He was right that Khomeini's ideology was a threat to his regime. He was catastrophically wrong about almost everything else. The quick strike did not produce a quick victory. Iranian forces, despite their disorganization, fought with a ferocity that surprised the invaders. The revolutionary ideology that Khomeini had been building, the glorification of martyrdom, the religious duty of self-sacrifice in defense of the Islamic Republic, proved to be a powerful mobilizing force on the battlefield. Young men and some boys volunteered in massive numbers. The Basij, a paramilitary volunteer force affiliated with the Revolutionary Guard, became famous or notorious for its tactics of human wave assaults, massed infantry charges that absorbed enormous casualties but overwhelmed Iraqi defensive positions through sheer weight of numbers. Khomeini rejected ceasefire offers from the United Nations and from various mediators. After Iranian forces recaptured the city of Khorramshahr in 1982, a victory celebrated throughout Iran as the City of Blood reconquered. They crossed the border into Iraq and pursued the war onto Iraqi territory. Khomeini had apparently decided that the war could not end short of the destruction of the Ba'athist regime and the creation of an Islamic Republic in Iraq. He was, in this, wrong again. But the war continued for 6 more years. The international dimensions of the conflict were complex and morally instructive. The United States, despite its official neutrality, provided intelligence support to Iraq and worked to prevent Iranian purchases of weapons. The argument was strategic. A revolutionary Islamic Iran was more threatening to American interests than a secular Ba'athist Iraq. This calculation, which resulted in American diplomatic cover for an Iraqi regime that used chemical weapons against Iranian troops and Kurdish civilians, would later haunt American foreign policy in ways that no one in Washington fully anticipated at the time. The Soviet Union also supported Iraq, at least initially, as did France, which sold Saddam Hussein Mirage fighters and other sophisticated weaponry. Iran found its arms suppliers largely in the shadows. North Korea, Libya,
Syria, and, in one of the Cold War's stranger subplots, the United States itself, through the arms for hostages deal that became the Iran-Contra scandal of 1986 to 1987. For the Islamic Republic, the war was simultaneously devastating and politically invaluable. Devastating in the most literal sense, estimates of Iranian casualties range from 300,000 to 500,000 killed, with another 500,000 to 700,000 wounded. Entire cities in western Iran were leveled by Iraqi bombardment. The economic cost was incalculable. The psychological cost. A generation of young Iranians who had grown up with the war as the central fact of their lives was incalculable in a different way. But politically, the war served the Islamic Republic in ways that can only be described as fortuitous for the government, if not for the people. Wars concentrate political power in governments. They provide justification for emergency measures, for the suppression of dissent, for the mobilization of patriotic sentiment against domestic critics. The Islamic Republic used the war years to complete the consolidation of its authority, closing newspapers, executing political opponents, purging the universities, and cementing the institutional architecture of the Wilayat al-Faqih that might have faced more organized resistance in peacetime. The war ended in July 1988 when Iran accepted United Nations Security Council Resolution 598 calling for a ceasefire. Khomeini described the decision as drinking poison. It was, in his framing, a humiliation, a surrender. He died 11 months later. At his death, the Islamic Republic he had built faced a world in which it was almost entirely isolated from Western diplomatic and economic relationships, engaged in various forms of proxy conflict across the Middle East, and entering a period of economic and political transition whose outcome was genuinely uncertain.
The relationship severed in 1979 with the United States, with much of Europe, with Israel, remained severed. The sanctions imposed in the wake of the hostage crisis had never been fully lifted. The war with Iraq had ended in stalemate. The revolutionary export project, the vision of inspiring similar revolutions throughout the Muslim world, had largely failed. The only successful export was Hezbollah in Lebanon, which became a powerful armed movement that fundamentally changed Lebanese politics and the Israeli-Lebanese equation. But the Islamic Republic had survived. Against considerable odds, against military invasion, against international pressure, against internal opposition, it had survived and consolidated. And it was preparing to enter its second phase, a phase in which the original revolutionary generation would gradually give way to a generation that had grown up under the revolution, and in which the question of what the revolution had actually been for would become, again, urgently live. The Swiss diplomat in Tehran, sorting through another stack of visa applications from Iranian Americans trying to visit their families in a country their government couldn't officially acknowledge, had long since stopped being surprised by anything. He had learned, in his years in this posting, that history in Iran moved in ways that defied the tidy categories of Western political analysis. He had also learned that it moved. Slowly, sometimes, and at great cost. But it moved. On June 4th, 1989, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran died. Ruhollah Khomeini, age 86, had been suffering from cancer and heart disease. He had spent his last months conducting what appeared to be a final settling of accounts, issuing the Rushdie fatwa in February, issuing a letter accepting the ceasefire with Iraq as more deadly than poison, resolving a succession dispute that had seen his chosen heir, Ayatollah Hussein Ali Montazeri, stripped of that designation and placed under effective house arrest after he had the temerity to publicly criticize the mass executions of political prisoners in 1988. Those executions, in which somewhere between 2,000 and 30,000 political prisoners, many of them members of the Mojahedin Khalq and other opposition groups, were executed in a matter of weeks following a secret order that is still disputed and denied by the Iranian government, were the final, darkest chapter of Khomeini's domestic legacy. They were conducted in secret, their scale concealed from the public and the world for years, and they represented a final, definitive answer to the question that had been open since 1979.
There was no space in the Islamic Republic for political opposition. There had never been. Khomeini died knowing that he had built something durable. The question was, what would happen when the man who had built it was gone? The answer surprised almost everyone. The assembly of experts moved with remarkable speed to designate a successor. Under the constitution as originally written, the supreme leader was required to be a marja, a highest-level Islamic scholar with a large following. Khomeini had been both politically revolutionary and theologically authoritative in the traditional sense. He commanded the loyalty of millions as a religious guide. His designated heir, Montazeri, would have fit the theological profile but had been disqualified for political reasons. The obvious alternatives: other senior clerics either lacked political loyalty to the revolution's principles or were too old and infirm. The assembly made an unconventional choice. Ali Khamenei, who had served as Iran's president since 1981, was elevated to supreme leader, despite the fact that he had not achieved the theological rank of marja. The constitution was quietly amended to remove the requirement. Khamenei's qualifications were political more than theological. He was a loyal revolutionary, a committed supporter of Wilayat al-Faqih, and a figure who the establishment believed could be relied upon to preserve what Khomeini had built without Khomeini's charisma or theological authority. He has been supreme leader ever since. More than 3 decades. Longer than Khomeini himself. Khomeini's Iran is both continuous with and different from Khomeini's Iran. The basic constitutional architecture has been preserved. The Wilayat al-Faqih remains in place. The Guardian Council still filters elections. The IRGC still serves as the ideological Praetorian Guard of the revolution.
But the specific political dynamics have evolved in ways that are genuinely complex. The most dramatic evolution came in 1997 when Mohammad Khatami, a reformist cleric who had been sidelined from his previous position as Minister of Culture for being too permissive toward cultural liberalization, ran for president on a platform of civil society, rule of law, and dialogue among civilizations. He won 70% of the vote in one of the largest electoral turnouts in Iranian history. His support was heaviest among women, young people, and the urban educated middle class, precisely the constituencies that the Islamic Republic had most systematically excluded and frustrated. Khatami's presidency, 1997-2005, was, in retrospect, a window onto what Iranian politics could look like when the space for genuine debate was widened even slightly. Newspapers proliferated. Intellectuals, artists, and filmmakers found more room to operate. Women gained somewhat more public presence. The economy managed more pragmatically than under the ideological constraints of the Khomeini era, showed signs of recovery. Internationally, Khatami pursued a dialogue of civilizations agenda that modestly improved Iran's relationships with Europe. But Khatami's presidency also revealed the limits of reform within the Islamic Republic's framework. Every time his government pushed against the boundaries of the permissible, the Guardian Council, the judiciary, and the IRGC pushed back. Reformist newspapers were closed as soon as they began publishing content that challenged clerical authority. Intellectuals who ventured too far were imprisoned or killed. The chain murders of 1998, in which a series of prominent writers and intellectuals were murdered by operatives linked to the intelligence ministry, was one of the most chilling demonstrations of what awaited those who challenged the system. Khatami was ultimately unable to implement the fundamental reforms his voters had hoped for, because the fundamental architecture of the Islamic Republic was not reformable from within by a president who lacked control over the security services, the judiciary, or the Guardian Council. His legacy was not institutional reform, but a generation of Iranians, the Khatami generation, who had experienced, briefly, a more open political environment and would not forget it. The backlash came in 2005 when Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, a hardliner with roots in the Revolutionary Guard, a populist economic message, and a confrontational foreign policy that included explicit Holocaust denial and threats against Israel, was elected president. His election was widely suspected to have been influenced by institutional manipulation. The Green Movement protests of 2009, triggered by the disputed presidential election in which Ahmadinejad was declared the winner over reformist candidate Mir Hossein Mousavi, were the largest popular uprising in Iran since the revolution itself. The Green Movement was suppressed violently.
The security forces killed dozens of protesters, hundreds were arrested, and some were tortured.
The movement's leaders, Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi, were placed under house arrest, where they remain to this day. The crackdown demonstrated, once again, that the Islamic Republic would not tolerate challenges to its fundamental structure, regardless of how those challenges were framed. The 2013 election of Hassan Rouhani, a centrist cleric who had served as nuclear negotiator and was perceived as a pragmatic modernizer, opened another brief window. The nuclear deal of 2015, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which placed limitations on Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief, was the most significant diplomatic achievement of the post-Khomeini era, and it briefly opened the possibility of a broader normalization of Iran's international position. The sanctions relief that followed began to modernize the economy and raise living standards. Then Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the deal in 2018, reimposing sanctions. The economic relief was reversed. The political opening that Rouhani's pragmatists had been using to argue for continued engagement closed again. The hardliners, who had always opposed the deal, pointed to the American withdrawal as proof that the West could not be trusted, and that Iran's only reliable protection was the continued development of its deterrent capabilities. The 2021 presidential election, won by Ibrahim Raisi, a hardline cleric who had served as one of the judges responsible for the 1988 mass executions, marked a definitive return to power of the conservative establishment. Raisi's government reversed many of the modest social relaxations that had occurred under Rouhani and reinvigorated enforcement of the moral codes that the morality police had been applying with varying degrees of consistency since the revolution. It was in this context that, in September 2022, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman named Mahsa Amini was arrested by the morality police in Tehran for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. She died in custody 3 days later. The circumstances of her death, whether she was beaten, whether she suffered a pre-existing medical condition that was worsened by the arrest, were disputed by the government and contradicted by her family and witnesses. Her death triggered the largest protest movement in Iran since 2009 and possibly since 1979. The slogan that emerged from the protests, Zan, Zendegi, Azadi, woman, life, freedom, was unlike anything that had come before. It was not a demand for Islamic reform or economic improvement or a fairer election. It was a direct challenge to the ideological core of the Islamic Republic, the mandatory hijab, the gender hierarchy, the equation of religious obedience with political submission. Women removed their headscarves in public and burned them. Men cut their hair in solidarity. Protests spread from Tehran to Tabriz, Isfahan, Mashhad, Zahedan, and then to the Iranian diaspora worldwide. University students marched despite knowing the risks. Schoolgirls sang protest songs. The protests were met with deadly force. Hundreds of protesters were killed, thousands arrested, and dozens executed in what human rights organizations described as a campaign of deliberate terror designed to restore order through mass intimidation. And yet, by early 2023, something had shifted. The streets were quieter. The immediate crisis had been suppressed, as previous crises had been suppressed. But Iranian women were continuing to appear in public without headscarves in numbers that made systematic enforcement impossible. The morality police effectively stood down in many urban areas. The government announced a review of the hijab laws without indicating any intention to repeal them. A face-saving gesture that acknowledged the scale of the challenge it faced without conceding the ideological ground. Khamenei, now in his mid-80s and reportedly in poor health, presided over a country whose fundamental political contradictions had never been resolved. The revolution that Khomeini had made in the name of God and the people had produced a government that used God's name to suppress the people. The republic that was supposed to differ from the monarchy had reproduced, in theocratic form, almost every feature of the monarchical oppression it had replaced. An unchecked supreme authority, a security apparatus that tortured and killed, a political system that could not accommodate genuine dissent. And yet, it had survived. For 4.5 decades, against every prediction of its imminent collapse, the Islamic Republic of Iran had survived. It had survived Khomeini's death. It had survived the Iran-Iraq War. It had survived the Green Movement.
It had survived sanctions, oil price collapses, COVID-19, and the relentless demographic pressure of a young, educated, increasingly secular population that was precisely the opposite of the devoted revolutionary vanguard the system had been designed to serve. Why? The answer has several parts. First, coercive capacity. The Islamic Republic has maintained robust security services. The IRGC, the Intelligence Ministry, the Basij, the police, that have proven willing to use lethal force against protesters. No protest movement can succeed against a government that is genuinely willing to massacre its own citizens, unless it can either split the security forces or receive foreign military assistance. Neither has happened. Second, economic resilience. Iran's oil economy, though damaged by sanctions, has never been completely broken. The government has maintained just enough economic capacity to provide basic services and patronage networks that sustain loyalty in key constituencies. The rural poor, the Bazari merchants, the IRGC's vast economic empire. Third, genuine ideological support. The revolution of 1979 was built on authentic popular grievance and authentic religious identity. 45 years later, there are still Iranians, genuinely, sincerely, who believe in the Islamic Republic's project. Not many, perhaps, and fewer among the young, but enough to provide a base of active support that pure coercion cannot explain.
Fourth, and perhaps most important, the opposition's failure to coalesce. The Green Movement of 2009, the protest movements of 2017 to 2018 and 2019, and the Woman, Life, Freedom movement of 2022 to 2023 have all demonstrated enormous popular appetite for change, but have not produced the kind of organized, coordinated political opposition that could challenge the state's capacity for repression. The Islamic Republic has been ruthlessly effective at preventing the emergence of exactly such opposition, arresting potential leaders before they can organize, criminalizing any contact with foreign-based opposition groups, maintaining a surveillance state that makes organizing extremely dangerous. The long-term trajectory of the Iranian Revolution is, 45 years in, genuinely uncertain. The system that Khomeini built has proven far more durable than its critics predicted, but it has also proven far less capable of adaptation and renewal than it would need to be to survive another 45 years in anything like its current form. Roya Tehrani, the young woman who stepped out of her alleyway and joined the revolution in January 1979, lived long enough to see her daughter arrested in the 2009 protests and her granddaughter photographed in the 2022 protests, headscarf in hand, staring down a line of riot police with the particular expression of someone who has inherited a grief from her grandmother and a fury from her mother, and has decided, finally, to do something with both. History did not give Roya or her daughter or her granddaughter a happy ending. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. The revolution that was supposed to liberate them exchanged one form of captivity for another, and the process of getting free is still ongoing. Slow, costly, interrupted by crackdowns and silences, but never quite stopped. What the 1979 Iranian Revolution produced, in the end, was not the liberation that its participants sought. It produced a new political order that was, in many ways, as oppressive as the one it replaced, and that proved devastatingly effective at consuming the idealism that had built it. The liberals were marginalized, the leftists were executed, the religious moderates were sidelined. Even many of Khomeini's original allies eventually found themselves in opposition to a system that had grown more rigid and more absolute than any of them had imagined. But the revolution also produced something else, a people who have now experienced, twice, what it means to demand freedom from a government that calls itself divinely ordained. A people whose political consciousness has been formed by two revolutions, one successful, one still ongoing. A people who know, in their bones, both the intoxication of collective defiance and the weight of collective disappointment, and who have not yet decided which feeling will, in the end, prove stronger. The world is still watching, and somewhere in Tehran, a young woman is deciding whether to step out of the alleyway. End. The revolution never really ended, it only changed shape.